it's Mo. This year, Simon Savidge of Savidge Reads and Louise Savidge of Louise Savidge Musings are doing a project where they picked 12 prompts from their followers, actually 13, one for each month, and then you're supposed to follow that prompt to read a book in that month, and then the 13th prompt is a bonus prompt. I love both those channels, and I decided that this would be another fun way to read down my TBR this year. I really liked a lot of the prompts that they had picked, so I did start this challenge back in January. It is now March and I am now behind on reading the prompts, so I wanted to start a reading vlog here so that I could get back on track reading the Savidge prompts for 2023. The prompts are divided by month, so you read one book per month. Obviously you can read more, you could read all of them in 1 month if you wanted to, you can extend it, or like me, you can skip months and then read 2 books that month or whatever. Or you can play this game the way that Books and Lala plays her buzzword readathon, which is just to see if she reads books that fit the prompt, and then at the end of the year go back and confirm that she did and read any of the ones that she hadn't read yet. Here are the prompts. January is blurbed by a favorite author. February's prompt is to read a book from the Stella Prize list. The Stella Prize is like the Australian Women's Prize. The prompt for March is to read a book with your favorite color on the cover. April's prompt is to read a book set in your favorite city. May is read a secondhand book or borrowed book. June is read a book inspired by your current outfit. July is read a book that you've been highly anticipating but that you've been saving. August is to read a book between the 2 world wars. I love books set between the 2 world wars. I don't like books set during the wars, but that in-between time is really fascinating to me. September's prompt is to read a book from a country that you've visited. October's book is to read a book with food in the title. November's prompt is to read a book that's been on your shelf forever. December's prompt is to read a book with weather words. And the bonus prompt is to read a book featuring a mother-son relationship. So those are the prompts that they picked for 2023. And like I said, I started this back in January and I'm gonna move over here, and I did end up reading the first prompt, a book blurbed by your favorite author. I couldn't go through every book that I have on my shelves or every book that I wanted to read and find out if one of my favorite authors blurbed that book. So I kind of switched this prompt around, and instead of reading a book that was blurbed by a favorite author, I picked a book by a favorite author and then used a blurb on that to pick my first read for January. So the book that I picked was The Only Good Indians. That was my favorite book of 2022. And one of the blurbs on the cover was by Paul Tremblay. So I have never read any Paul Tremblay. I thought this was the perfect time to dip into his work. The book that I really wanted to read was Cabin at the End of the World, but I don't have a copy of that one and I haven't been able to get my hands on it. So I ended up reading his short story, The Last Conversation. The Last Conversation is a sci-fi futuristic story where the main character wakes up in a hospital room. He doesn't know what's going on. He has lost many of his memories, but he starts to communicate with the doctor there, and he starts to piece together information from his life, including the fact that he and this doctor have a relationship outside of doctor-patient. This is a very short story that I found on one of my subscriptions. Those subscriptions are such a great way to get into authors that you've never read before, authors that you have read before but you'd like to read more of. And they're great for like taste testing authors and for genres too, because there's a lot of different genres contained in those short stories. So The Last Conversation is sci-fi, but I've also read horror, I've read paranormal thriller / romance, I've read nonfiction. Although The Last Conversation wasn't the strongest of these stories that I've read, I did really enjoy it, and it did make me excited to read more by Paul Tremblay. That completed my prompt for January. If you're playing along, there is a Storygraph challenge created where you can see all the prompts and get ideas for books that you might want to read along the prompt themes, and I have my books in there as well. For February's prompt, it was to read a book off the Stella Prize. Like I said earlier, the Stella Prize is basically the Australian Women's Prize, but it does focus heavily on Australian authors. When I was trying to find my book for this prompt, I just went to the Stella Prize Wikipedia and I looked at all the long listed, looked at all the shortlisted, looked at all the winners from the last few years, and tried to find a book that I either had or was interested in reading. And that book turned out to be The Bass Rock by Evie Wyld. I read Evie Wyld's All the Birds Singing a few years ago and I really liked it. It had a really interesting dual timeline that moved in an interesting direction, and I wondered if The Bass Rock was going to have something similar. So I have started The Bass Rock and I'm about 30% of the way in so far. The Bass Rock does also follow several timelines, but unlike All the Birds Singing, we're not following one main character, we're following several main characters, and they are mostly different generations of the same family. From what I can tell, they're all from one family, but I'm not sure. In the present day, which is, I think, around 2017, we're following Viv. She's cleaning out a house on the Scottish coast where she can see a view of the Bass Rock, which is a rock formation off the shore. This is a family home and she's visited many times, and her family is paying her to clean the house out after her grandmother has died. So she's talking about her own life. She's dealing with some mental health issues. She's also talking about her relationship to the owner of the house, her grandmother. She's talking about her familial relationship, how her mother is connected to her grandmother, how her father is connected to her grandmother, and she's kind of navigating her mental health through all of this. We're also following Ruth, who is her grandmother, and it's back in the early 1900s, the 1920s or so, where she is coming to live in the house for the first time with her new husband and her two stepsons. From Ruth's perspective, we're seeing her settling into the community there, settling into the house, sending the two boys to boarding school, her relationship with her husband's relationship to his first wife who has died. And in Ruth's perspective, we're definitely learning the connections of all these people. And then there's a third storyline, which we're not getting as much of, but that's taking place in like the mid 1800s, maybe possibly even the 1700s, all around the same area where a disgraced preacher and his son are living, and there is a plague going around, a famine and sickness, and the preacher's wife and daughter have succumbed to this sickness, and the town kind of looks at them as if they started this plague. When the preacher discovers that some townspeople have captured a witch and are going to burn her at the stake, he goes to her rescue, and where we are in the story right now, the preacher and his son are helping this young girl recover from the abuses and trauma that she faced of the townspeople, learning her story and figuring out what they're going to do next. So that's where I am in the book, and it is really interesting, and I do see similarities between The Bass Rock and All the Birds Singing, but I am struggling a little bit. I'm reading The Bass Rock on audio, and I struggle with multiple timelines, multiple perspectives in general. It's not my favorite thing in books, and I find that reading it on audio can be quite difficult. I'm struggling to understand who all the characters were. It took me a really long time to figure out that Ruth and Viv were related. I don't know yet if our earliest timeline, the people are also related, but I'm guessing that they are. I even had to write down everyone's like names and their connections, which I very, very rarely do. I know that some booktubers make character maps all the time, but I barely ever do, and I had to jot it down as I was first listening. I think I kind of have a handle on it now, but there's a lot of discussion of like mental health, and if you are struggling mentally, whether you are ill or whether you are just dealing with life. There's a lot of discussion about being othered and being looked down on, ostracized by the community, and villainized by the community, which is interesting. I am enjoying it. I definitely do enjoy the writing style. I think that the audio narration is good. It's narrated by 3 different people, 2 women and a man for the different timelines. which helps a little bit, but not as much as I actually need. So I'm going to continue reading The Bass Rock, and then at the end of this video, I will try to pick March's pick for the Savidge prompts. It's currently March. I definitely will finish The Bass Rock this month, but I don't know if I will continue to be behind a month or if I can catch up on these prompts. Let me know if you're participating with the Savidge prompts. If you are, let me know what you read for January and February. Let me know what you plan to read for March. And when I read some more, I'll let you know. I have read more of The Bass Rock. Right after I talked to you at about the 35% mark, there was like a very dread-filled scene, and I hate that feeling, that anticipating dread and that idea that you know something is wrong with the situation and you're just waiting for the shoe to drop and you're waiting for the characters to realize what you have already realized is an effed up place to be or a thing to do or people to be with or whatever the situation is. And so it took me actually kind of a while to steel my nerve to be able to get past that part. I'm glad I did, and I'm definitely like recognizing the characters and the readers for the different characters more. And now I'm at about 75%, and I'm wondering how all these stories are going to show their connections, because we already know the connections between the current day timeline and the past timeline for the most part, and we can guess some of the connections to the far past timeline, but how these timelines are going to kind of wrap up and what the final repercussions of each storyline is going to have on the next storyline. So obviously the far past is going to have something to do with why the middle past is the way it is, and the middle past is going to have something to do with why the current day is the way that it is. I'm at the point where I just have to figure that out, but I really at this moment don't know what the answer is going to be. After reading those kind of dreadful passages and after learning more about the pasts of some of the people involved in this story, I see more of that kind of creeping dread and that anticipatory feeling that I don't like. And I do remember that being similar to All the Birds Singing, that feeling where you knew that the main character of that book was in a bad situation, but you didn't know why. So this feels the same, like just weird things keep happening and you don't really trust the people surrounding our main characters and what their motivations are, and you don't really know what our main characters are going to do based on the mistrust of their fellow people in the storyline. Definitely has a ton of like trigger warning for sexual assault and sexual assault of children, murder, alcoholism, drug abuse, so many different things. But I think one of the major conversations is the idea that women have to just deal with their lot in life. And in every timeline, the women are saying, well, that's just how it is. Like sometimes you just get sexually assaulted, and sometimes you just have to live in a loveless marriage, and sometimes you just have to allow someone to cheat on you, and sometimes you just have to put up with your parents' disapproval. And so the conversation, I think, is all about like women's lot in life, but in a way that highlights how wrong and ridiculous it is that women put up with so much to the present day. The things that they put up with in some ways change, but in some ways stay exactly the same. So I am enjoying it, and I'm glad that I got past that like 35% mark, because I was really struggling to get through that. But in the meantime, while I finish that, I have also picked up my book for March. So March's Savidge prompt was to pick a book with your favorite color on it, and my favorite color is gray, if you can't tell by my thumbnails. And so I picked up The Death of Mrs. Westaway by Ruth Ware. I've had this book on my shelves for a really long time. I know my friend Jess from Jess the Book Freak has read this one, and I'm interested to see what I think of it and then go back and see her reviews of it and compare. I've only read one Ruth Ware book before, and I really, really disliked it. It was The Woman in Cabin in 10, and I really hated that our main character was an alcoholic, and therefore she was an unreliable narrator. I really hated the resolve of that mystery. I just didn't like it at all. So I'm very interested to read another Ruth Ware and see whether that book wasn't for me, or maybe her writing in general isn't for me. I'm about 100 pages into The Death of Mrs. Westaway, so a little under a third, a little over, well, no, more like a quarter. I'm about a quarter of the way through. I think that there's a little too much exposition so far right now, a little too much repetitive nature of getting to know our main character instead of getting on with the story. That could just be set up, so, you know, maybe it'll get a little bit faster paced and a little bit more, I don't want to say action packed because I'm not necessarily looking for action, but less of a repeating of what we've already learned and more of learning new things. The Death of Mrs. Westaway follows Harriet, who goes by the nickname Hal. She is a young woman living in Brighton in England, and she is barely surviving and barely making a living as a psychic and tarot reader on the Brighton boardwalk. I really like that and feel a connection to that. We have a psychic here in Asbury Park, but if you didn't know, Asbury Park is a shore town, and we are a tourist-based town, mostly revolving around our boardwalk and beaches. So I definitely feel immediately connected with our main character, Hal. I also really like that she has short hair, and I really like that she has glasses. And I realized that except for a few books where people wear glasses, but it's kind of said as something that they do, but not really talked about, I really enjoy reading from a person's perspective who wears glasses. Like, you know, she's out in the rain and her glasses are wet and she can't see, and like she has to pick up her glasses in the morning when she gets out of bed. Like it's nice to see that representation, even though that's like a very strange representation to have in a book, and also a very extremely common thing that people all over the world have to deal with all the time. But one you don't see much in writing. Not only is she living like hand to mouth, she's living like dollar to dollar. She's extremely worried about her bills. She's extremely worried about paying rent on her tiny apartment and tiny kiosk that she uses on the boardwalk. She's being hounded by debt collectors, and when she gets a letter from an estate saying that her grandmother died, she is really torn because she knows that her grandparents died a very long time ago, and this person, Mrs. Westaway, who seemingly included her in her will, can't possibly be Hal's real grandma. We're learning the story of Hal. We're learning about why she's alone at 21 or whatever she is, why she's scrounging to make ends meet, how she learned to read tarot. And that's an element of this book that I was really surprised and happy about. I like tarot and that whole idea of divination. I had no idea that that was in this book. I have a feeling that Jess liked that too, because she recently read The Cloisters, which apparently has something to do with tarot as well, and she was saying there wasn't enough tarot in it, so I'm excited to see if the tarot in this was more to her liking. We're learning about why it's so tempting for Hal to show up at this funeral and see if she can possibly get some of the money that this mysterious grandmother has left her, even though it's not hers to be left. So that's where I am with that one. I'm going to continue reading this physically, and I'm going to try to finish the Bass Rock soon. Since I've already completed January's prompt, I should be up to date for April on the Savidge prompts. So when I read some more, I'll let you know. Yesterday I finished The Bass Rock. This was a really interesting one. I felt similarly to the way that I felt about All the Birds Singing, in that it was very well written, interestingly written. The writing itself is imbued with a long-term like dread and anticipatory feeling. Sometimes that got to be too much for me in both books, and sometimes it was just right. But the entire time that you're reading the Basrock, you know bad things are happening and that bad things are going to continue to happen, and you're wondering if there is going to be a big reveal or denouement or something that changes the course of the story. But ultimately it's only about women's suffering, the continuation of women's suffering, and the constant suffering that women have to go through, mainly at the hands of men. I think that listening to this one on audio was a little bit of a disservice. Even though I really like the audio narration, I think that I would have liked to have listened and read along physically, because between the chapters of the 3 timelines that we're following more closely, there were interspersements of other stories, and that was very confusing to me on audio. I didn't even really realize that that was happening until about 3/4 of the way through the book, and we had had so many that I could see the pattern of there being extra stories interspliced between the main storylines that we were following. If I had been reading it physically, I'm sure there was something in the book, either a chapter break or italics or a different font or something like that, that would have let me know that these were not a story that I was waiting to connect with the other story, but a totally different stories. And all the stories and all the timelines that we're following had the same theme, which was the suffering and mistreatment, abuse of women. Definitely not an easy read, but I think there's something in Evie Wyld's writing that is really beautiful and compelling, like you want to keep reading, even though her stories tend to be fairly quiet, and even though there's that dreadful feeling throughout, there aren't a lot of places where there's a big reveal, something that changes the story drastically. You are compelled to keep reading, and even though you're suffering along with the characters, you are compelled to keep going and keep hearing about their stories. So I am super glad to have read another Evie Wyld, and I definitely look forward to reading more from her. I finished that yesterday, and that was the February prompt to read something off the Stella Prize, and the Basrock won the Stella Prize in 2022. Nominees for 2023 have been announced, and so I think this is an interesting prize, not one that I will follow along with closely like I do the Women's Prize, the International Booker, or some of the other prizes, but I think it's one that I'll keep my eye on and try to read more from throughout the years. Not that I read a lot from the other prizes, but I do like to hear the long list announcements, hear the short list announcements, and try to read off of those lists when I can. I'm not like a Bob the Booker person who's like following the prize super closely, but I do enjoy reading prize books to see why they might have been on prize lists or what the judges might have seen in them. And then this morning I was able to finish March's prompt. I think when I had last spoke to you, I was about 1/4 of the way through, and we were learning about our main character, Hal. She was contacted by a solicitor saying that her grandmother had died and that she was going to get something in the will. So she travels to this remote estate that was her grandmother's, and she meets all these people who may or may not be her uncles and her cousins. She knows that she's going there under the pretense of being this person who she knows she is not. So she is scamming the family, and as she learns more about the family, she feels more and more sad about this idea. She's really torn between telling them the truth or potentially getting out of her bad situation back home by taking the money and running. I don't usually do this, but let's do the good things. So the good things, I like the idea of Hal's character. The idea was that she was a young woman who, since the age of 18 when her mother died, had to fend for herself, and that she wore glasses and that she had tattoos and that she could read tarot cards. And I think my favorite part of this entire book was her interpretation of the tarot and how she did readings for people and how the tarot played into some of the decisions that she made, even though she, being a tarot reader, knows the truth or deception of tarot, even though she knows that tarot is only a way to think about the ideas that you might have, think about the questions that you might have, think about what you already know in a different light, but not necessarily a fortune-telling device. I enjoyed the idea of found family, like literally finding your family, and the idea of how that would make a person feel who had grown up solely with their mother and then grown up for the last 5 or 6 years solely on their own. I thought that was interestingly done in parts. I definitely love a creepy old mansion. I love a creepy old housekeeper. So those kind of gothic elements were cute. There was a couple of references, although they were only in the beginning, to other gothic stories or mystery stories. There was reference to Agatha Christie, there was a reference to Rebecca de Mornay, and so those things were cute sprinkled in there. So on to the things that I didn't like about this book. It was way too long. I recently read The Sanatorium, and that book felt like an outline that someone had written and then didn't bother to fill anything in. And this felt like the opposite. This book felt like Ruth Ware had an outline, had an idea, wanted to incorporate tarot, and she took it to her publishers and they were like, it's great, just add 350 more pages and you'll have a book. So she just upped the word count. She repeated things numerous times. She told you about things, didn't show you. You know, she told us about how tough and strong Hal was, but then she was like a quivering, heap of jelly in the book. She told us about how she was such a good reader of the tarot and such a good reader of people, but she absolutely continually made mistakes and misread people and misjudged people, and the whole book hung on that. She told us about how Hal was so good at concealing her own identity, but Hal continuously put her foot in her mouth, revealing things that she shouldn't have, talking to the wrong people, trusting the wrong people. So it really felt like no effort or work went into this. She just upped the word count as much as she possibly could, repeated things as much as she possibly could, and then the book was finished. I also felt that the storyline was pretty thin. It was very obvious what most of the plot reveals were going to be and who the ultimate culprit was going to be, and it just was intensely boring for the majority of the book. There was also not a lot of mystery in the book. Like, Hal didn't take the opportunity to talk to people or get clues or discover things while she was in the house that she could have taken. She continuously did stupid things like leaving her phone behind. This book was written in 2017 and it takes place like maybe a couple years earlier than that, 2015 or something like that. There's no way that you would go searching through a house without your phone. There's no way that you would let certain things like that go or not be prepared, especially when you're supposed to be this person who was prepared for any eventuality, a person who had fended for themselves for all these years. And then the ending was cliched, fairly obvious, and also fairly unsatisfying. So I think this is definitely my last Ruth Ware book. I read 2. I really disliked both of them. I will say that the writing in this is better than the writing in The Sanatorium, so it does not take The Sanatorium's place as the worst book that I've read so far this year. This is still above that one. I'm glad to have read it, and I'm glad that it's over with. I'm glad that it fits so well March's prompt, and I'll probably be unhauling this one at the end of the year. In this vlog, I've done January, sort of, February, and March, so we'll see what April brings. Let me know if you want to see one book per vlog, similar to my TBR spin vlogs, where I just vlog the book for that month now that I'm caught up, or if you would rather have me do these vlogs every couple of months and have more books in the mix. Thanks so much for joining me today, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!